Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for Puerto Rico in the United States. How did we get here and where are we going? A panel discussion. My name is Michelle Fernandez. I'm a librarian in the Department of Programs and Partnerships here at Arlington Public Library, and I will be moderating tonight's panel. This event is part of the library's commemoration of Hispanic Heritage Month, which includes everything from salsa lessons to musical performances to story times and crafts for all ages. Visit us online at library.arlingtonva.us to sign up for one of the 3,000 community programs we conduct every year and to stay up to date on library services. I'd like to thank our county partners from Arlington TV for making this panel discussion available to stream live on the library's Facebook page and available for later viewing at tv.arlingtonva.us. We're here tonight to talk about Puerto Rico, which has been on the tip of all of our tongues since Hurricane Maria made landfall on the island 1 year ago today. Here in Arlington, we've been touched by this tragedy in big and in little ways. 12 Arlington County police officers volunteered to deploy to Puerto Rico to assist in the recovery efforts. Arlington's own Lost Dog and Cat Rescue was one of several local shelters who opened their doors to Puerto Rican dogs and cats left homeless by the hurricane. And this year, the Friends of the Arlington Public Library donated $1 for each person who completed our summer reading program to aid the rebuilding efforts of the Águedo Mojica Marrero Library at the University of Puerto Rico at Humacao, which suffered substantial damages to its facility and collections as a result of the storm. 5,354 people completed our summer reading program, and the Friends of the Library donated $5,369.17, which is $1 for each participant plus $15.17 in unsolicited cash donations from Arlington children. Tonight's topic is dear to my heart as a proud Jerezana, a graduate of the University of Puerto Rico's Rio Piedras campus, and as a second-generation New Yorican. My maternal grandparents left San Sebastián, Puerto Rico in the mid-1950s at the height of the mass migration of Puerto Ricans to New York. My family were traditionally sugarcane farmers. The rapid industrialization of the island that took place in the post-World War II era, largely due to a series of federal and local initiatives known as Operation Bootstrap, rendered many traditional agrarian trades in Puerto Rico obsolete. Combined with the recent affordability of air travel and the advantage of U.S. citizenship, it was a no-brainer for thousands of Puerto Ricans to come to the mainland in pursuit of economic opportunity. My mother was the first of her siblings born in New York. I was born and raised on Long Island. If you, like me, grew up in the United States and were educated in our public school system, chances are you learned little or nothing in history class about United States overseas territories, which include not just Puerto Rico, but also the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands, as well as free associated states that include Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. The territories are usually discussed in passing when students learn about the Spanish-American War, which ended with the Treaty of Paris, in which Puerto Rico and Guam were ceded to the United States, the Philippines were bought for $20 million, and Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. But a lot has happened since then, in the 120 years that Puerto Rico has been a territory of the United States, to further complicate the relationship between these two places. In 1917, Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship, and 20,000 Puerto Ricans were drafted in the final years of World War I. In 1950, Congress enacted legislation authorizing Puerto Rico to hold a constitutional convention, and in 1952, the Puerto Rican Constitution, which established its current status as a commonwealth, or free associated state, went into effect. From 1948 to 1957, La Ley de la Mordaza, known in English as the Gag Law, suppressed the growing Puerto Rican independence and nationalist movements by making it illegal to own or display the Puerto Rican flag, to sing a patriotic song, to speak or write of independence, or to hold any assembly in favor of Puerto Rican independence. In 1954, a group of Puerto Rican nationalists led by Lolita Lebrón opened fire in the U.S. Capitol, wounding 5 congressmen. From 1941 until 2003, the U.S. military occupied the island of Vieques, which is part of the Puerto Rican archipelago. In April 1999, a civilian was killed during routine bomb practice, which sparked mass protests against the use of the land by the United States Navy and United States Marine Corps for bombing target practice. These protests were ultimately successful, and the island of Vieques has been free of a military presence for 15 years. Puerto Rico's main political parties are divided by their opinions on the status debate, whether the island should become a U.S. state, a sovereign nation, or remain something in between. The ultimate decision on this issue, however, rests with U.S. Congress. Despite over a century of U.S. presence on the island, Puerto Rico retains a distinct culture and sense of national identity. The daily language of the vast majority of Puerto Ricans is Spanish. The Puerto Rican government observes local holidays such as the Grito de Lares, which commemorates the 1868 revolt against Spanish rule on the island, as well as U.S. federal holidays such as the 4th of July. Puerto Rico has its own Olympic team, its own disproportionately successful entry into the Miss Universe pageant. And if you've ever been within a mile radius of a Puerto Rican Day parade, you'll know that its people are very, very proud and not afraid to show it. Before the arrival of Hurricane Maria, the island was subject to severe austerity measures in an effort to contend with its massive debt, and the infrastructure had suffered for decades. The island's power grid was in dire need of maintenance, even reconstruction, and water pumping stations, bridges, levees, roads, all had been starved for investment for years. Even people's homes weren't as strong as they might have been. Before the storm, the island could afford only 5 building code inspectors for a population of 3.5 million people. 1 year ago today, Hurricane Maria, the 10th most intense Atlantic hurricane in recorded history, made landfall in Puerto Rico. 2 weeks prior, Hurricane Irma had struck the island, leaving about 80,000 people without power as Hurricane Maria approached. The storm completely destroyed the island's power grid, sending the entire island into the worst blackout in U.S. history. 1.5 million people lacked potable water, 75,000 homes were demolished, and an additional 300,000 were damaged. Supplies and aid were scarce. A year later, we're still not sure of the death toll. So how did we get here? The goal of tonight's panel is to give an introduction to the complicated relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, to explore the ways in which that relationship has directly contributed to the recovery efforts from Hurricane Maria, and to discuss what the future may hold and what we as citizens can do. Please join me in welcoming our fantastic panel. We were initially supposed to have 5 panelists. Unfortunately, Luis Davila was not able to join us. Our first panelist is Juan Declet-Barreto, who is a geographer and climate scientist in the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. He partners with environmental justice groups and activists to research the potential effects of carbon policy and climate change on communities of color and other climate-vulnerable communities. Juan holds a PhD in environmental social science from Arizona State University. He serves on the board of Puerto Rico Rises, a group of Puerto Ricans organizing to help in the collection, transport, delivery, and rebuilding of Puerto Rico, town by town. Please welcome Juan. Federico de Jesús is the founder and principal of FDJ Solutions, LLC. He was the National Communications Director for Hispanic Media in the Obama for America 2008 presidential campaign and in the office of the president-elect. Subsequently, he served as a political appointee in the U.S. Department of Transportation as Associate Director for Governmental Affairs. Prior to the Obama campaign, he was the Director for Hispanic Communications in U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's office, and he also served in a similar capacity for House Democratic Leader Nancy Pelosi. More recently, Federico served as Deputy Director for the Governor of Puerto Rico's D.C. office. He appears regularly in the media as a political commentator and volunteers for several charitable causes, including the Big Brother, Big Sister program of the National Capital Area, fundraising for disaster relief with the American Red Cross, and he currently serves as a court-appointed special advocate working with DC foster youth. Please welcome Federico. Angel Nigaglioni serves as legislative director and counsel to Congressman José Serrano. He has worked for Congressman Serrano since 2013, and his legislative portfolio includes foreign affairs, defense, intelligence, science, space, energy, homeland security, commerce, trade, and financial services. Angel earned a bachelor's degree summa cum laude in international affairs from the George Washington University, where he was inducted to Phi Beta Kappa. He also earned a Juris Doctor from the Indiana University Maurer School of Law, where he was president of the Latino Law Student Association and managing editor of the Indiana Journal of Global Legal Studies. Please welcome Angel. Finally, Angelique Sina is co-founder and president of Friends of Puerto Rico and has been leading philanthropic efforts in Puerto Rico to support and foster economic development since 2015. In 2017, she received the Brava Award from Smart CEO magazine for raising $2.5 million in 5 weeks for Puerto Rico's recovery efforts. Born and raised in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, she graduated from Stanford Business University Latino Entrepreneurship Program. Angelique has been driving economic development at World Bank Group since 2012. In 2016, she was appointed by the mayor of Washington, D.C. as the commissioner for the Latino community. She was chosen as a change maker at the White House United State of Women Summit and was a nominee for Forbes' 30 Under 30. Please welcome Angelique. So we will begin with a discussion among the panelists, and then there will be an opportunity for audience members to ask questions at the end of the panel. So let's begin. So when I was planning this event, a very astute colleague pointed out that the title could be a little confusing. She said, Puerto Rico and the United States, isn't that redundant? Isn't Puerto Rico part of the United States? Isn't that like saying New York in the United States? I said, not exactly. I think the question is more complicated than many Americans know. Puerto Rico has been a territory of the United States for 120 years. Puerto Ricans have been American citizens since 1917. In 1901, the US Supreme Court defined Puerto Rico as foreign to the United States in a domestic sense, because it was neither a state nor a sovereign republic. The official term for the island's political status in Spanish is Estado Libre Asociado, which translates to free associated state. It is often called a commonwealth. This is understandably confusing for those outside of the island. So this first question for Angel. In your opinion, how does the unique political, economic, and cultural relationship between the island and the mainland shape the lives and experiences of modern-day Puerto Ricans?
Well, this unique colonial relationship affects us in every single way. Number one, politically, you have Puerto Ricans who are second-class citizens when you live in the island. You move to the mainland and you're a first-class citizen. You can't vote for the president in Puerto Rico while you live in Puerto Rico. You move to France, you can vote for the president. You can't elect Congress members except a non-voting delegate. You can't have access to the same equal treatment, federal programs. With regards to your culture, Puerto Rican culture it's very unique. You have the ability to have your identity in a country that is composed of cultures from all around the world. Being a colony, you've been able to maintain your language, your religion, your food. I'm originally from Ponce, Puerto Rico. And I can tell you that I'm a proud American citizen who came from a colony, but hopes to die in a state. And what we see today, the economic crisis that we see today in Puerto Rico, is the direct result of its colonial relationship with the United States. When you don't have the equal rights and equal responsibilities as your fellow citizens in this country, you're bound to fail. You're bound to stay behind. You're bound to always try to catch up. But you never can. Because when you have federal programs, and you're the last one to be added to the federal programs when they're enacted, but you're the first one to be cut out of the program when programs have reduced funding, you're bound to fail. Puerto Rico's debt crisis was the result of an island that had to borrow money to cover costs for social programs that should have been covered by the federal government. So, in this sense, our colonial situation affects every single aspect of our relationship between the island and the 50 states. I like to refer to the mainland as the 50 states because... Don't forget about DC. Yes, but at least in DC, you can vote for the president and you have equal access to federal programs. Puerto Rico, you don't even have that. So with that, I'll let my fellow panelists answer. Thank you.
Fede.
So we could have a panel discussion on this for the whole evening, and when people ask me about the U.S.-Puerto Rico relationship, I say, well, do you have 500 years to spare so we can talk? Just a small chat. I'll try to be as brief as possible, given this is a complex issue. I think that your introduction was more or less on the mark. Puerto Rico is foreign in a domestic sense. And the insular cases, and I'm not going to get into legalese. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, although I've studied history. It's a racist set of politically motivated cases, basically, that say that Puerto Rico is owned by, but is not a part of the United States. So to your question, well, isn't Puerto Rico part of the U.S.? It's complicated, like the movie says. But what does that mean? Basically, we are a colony, and that may surprise some people that know me, because I have defended the Commonwealth status in the past. And I do think that it's very simple to suggest that because Puerto Rico hasn't been a state, that our economic development has fallen behind. In fact, in the 1980s, Puerto Rico's economic development as a percentage of GDP was higher than in the States. Puerto Rico had advantages that states didn't have, including tax exemption from federal taxes when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to federal income taxes. And that allowed Puerto Rico to have a measure of economic development it wouldn't have otherwise have had. And part of the economic crisis that Angel correctly mentioned is a result of Congress's arbitrary decision to eliminate those tax incentives. Now, I don't want to confuse you with thinking that Puerto Rico is a tax haven like the Cayman Islands. These tax incentives helped U.S. manufacturing companies like Merck, like Pfizer, that paid engineers and good paying jobs. My dad worked for Merck, so I knew firsthand what those benefits meant. Not only for those people who had employment, but also because the deal was that those manufacturing companies, although exempt from federal taxes, had to invest in Puerto Rican banks, and that allowed the liquidity of the economy to flow. So when that was eliminated, Puerto Rico started to borrow heavily so it could make up for the lost 100,000 jobs or so, plus the fleeing of that capital. Puerto Rico is now very dependent on the federal government, and Angel is right, we do not receive federal funding on par with the states, although we don't pay federal income taxes. And there are a lot of injustices in the relationship. We do not vote for president. We do not have members of Congress. But the federal laws, as applied to Puerto Rico in a cookie-cutter way, don't necessarily address Puerto Rico's unique socioeconomic challenges. For example, and we'll get into the hurricane in a minute, but the way that FEMA is set up for disaster relief, for example, the local governments are supposed to take the lead. State governments get support from FEMA, and that chain of distribution of aid is supposed to be handled that way. The problem with a hurricane like Maria is that the local government broke down, and FEMA was saying, well, it's not my job to give out water. It's the job of the mayor. Well, the mayor can't get out of his house because his roof is broken and the streets are closed, and there aren't any police officers because they don't have water or electricity, and they're in the same situation. So when you apply federal programs and laws such as the Jones Act, which has been discussed in the media, that makes shipping costs a lot more expensive for Puerto Rico, and it would stay the same as the state. So I do agree that the U.S. political relationship is unfair. It should be addressed. But it's a little bit too simple to blame the hurricane on statehood or the economic crisis on colonialism. Katrina happened in a city that's part of a state, and nobody's talking about giving Louisiana back to France. And so, you know, racism plays a large part of the hurricane response, not necessarily the Puerto Rico-U.S. relationship. But to sum it up, it is undemocratic to have a group of citizens not elect or have a say over the laws that apply to them. The way that I propose to solve it is not through statehood, number one, because that means more taxes, the loss of the national identity symbols such as the Olympic team and whatnot, but also it's an economic issue. Puerto Rico is heavily dependent on government for employment. It has its own tax system. If you impose federal taxes, that means the government has a lot less money to pay for those federal employees, for those local employees. And what will happen is probably they'll continue to come to the mainland United States. There's a GAO study that studied the economic impact of statehood, and it concluded that it would cost jobs in Puerto Rico. I'm not saying that we should keep the relationship as it is. I think that after Congress imposed a fiscal control board, which basically eviscerated the local authority over government the Commonwealth granted, needs to be addressed. But these issues are really complicated, and I urge you to do a little research and not fall for the sound bites that some politicians like to, to suggest that things have a simple answer, because unfortunately we've been dealing this for 500 years and we're still here. I'll be happy to answer questions because I know this is a complex matter. Thank you.
Juan, your thoughts?
Hi. Well, I agree with Angela and Federico about the basic fact that that Puerto Rico is a territory of the U.S. and it's a colony, and that is at the heart of the issues that Puerto Rico confronts. So, like Federico was saying, the details are the legalese, and the details are messy. There's a patchwork of laws and policies and regulations, but the general gist of it is very simple to understand. Puerto Rico, the path of development of Puerto Rico, and the reason why Puerto Rico and the U.S. are here today in the way that the relationship is and the way that things are, is because the United States has wanted that, things to be that way. Because all of the decisions that have put Puerto Rico in the current trajectory of fiscal crisis and climatic crisis that hit rock bottom last year were because of impositions that Puerto Ricans were not consulted about, that Puerto Ricans did not have an effective way to enter into those discussions and to make decisions that would affect their future, in the way that energy is produced, in the way that cities were developed, in the way that commerce is made, and so there are all these hosts of decisions that have been impositions from the United States government that have severely curtailed the exercise of democratic rights in Puerto Rico. So that is the kind of thing that we need to ask ourselves when many people in the American public who do not understand what the relationship, like Michelle was saying, the relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. What are Puerto Ricans? Are they Americans? Are they not? Is it foreign? Is it a separate country? Is it somewhere in Mexico? I've had that question asked many times.
Me too.
So I think that's that is the basic relationship, the basic mechanism that has shaped the situation that Puerto Rico finds itself in. Of course, that doesn't excuse the really poor performance of both the federal government and the Puerto Rican government, not just during the response to Hurricane Maria, but the chronic corruption and mismanagement that in Puerto Rican politics and the Puerto Rican government that has led to this. And so I think that as we're seeing this unfold for some of us, very personally, from afar, through news, through conversations with family members, and by going there and seeing how things are unfolding, it's obvious that we need to have some sort of new ground rules or some new form of social contract between the United States and Puerto Rico, because obviously the project of nation building in the Caribbean or in Latin America that Puerto Rico was supposed to exemplify for the United States, it's obviously not working. It's not working in general. It has worked out for some individuals and some people, but for the majority of Puerto Ricans, it hasn't really worked out. So I'd like to leave it at that and allow Angelique to say something.
Thank you. Well, I'm in a very difficult position because I'm the only woman here in this panel. But I will say that, in my opinion, personal opinion, I will say that any relationship similar to what we're encountering is complicated. We can talk about marriages. We can talk about relationships with our sisters. It is complicated. For me, I've had the opportunity to work with different countries, different islands, and I always try to compare, what would be a perfect example for us if we would be independent or if it would be a state. What is a similar state in terms of poverty? Well, it's Mississippi. We have double the poverty rate, which is very sad. However, islands on itself struggle, and there's not a perfect model that we could compare an island like Puerto Rico with an independent island, a sovereign country, that a model that we could apply. So it is very complicated. I know we have other great questions, so I will allow and pause on that because I know Michelle wants to keep going with the program.
Thank you.
Can not let Angelique get away without mentioning, I don't think that you mentioned that she's the president of Friends of Puerto Rico in the intro, and if you did, I just want to reiterate that she did. She did raise literally a ton of money to help Puerto Ricans after the hurricane. So I didn't want to miss the opportunity to thank her for that because she's done a great job. And if you didn't mention it, I wanted to say that.
Thank you. I did mention it. Okay. As Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, can you talk about the ways in which island-wide issues are discussed differently inside and outside the island? In times of crisis and otherwise, how do you find reliable information about what is taking place on the island? And do you think public discourse about Puerto Rico is focused on the right issues? We'll start with Juan.
I think this is very interesting because when there's a host of different ways in which people talk about Puerto Rico when you're looking from the U.S. towards Puerto Rico. When we're messaging around, there's a need for a comprehensive federal aid package for 3.5 million U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico and another 200,000 in U.S. Virgin Islands. It's very useful to use that, and it's very convenient also to remind the American public that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, to compel people to action. And even in the questions that were asked by your colleague, is it redundant to say U.S. versus as something separate from Puerto Rico? Well, when you're in Puerto Rico and talking to Puerto Rican people and you're then looking towards the United States, people recognize that the United States is one thing and Puerto Rico is another. Literally, people in Puerto Rico refer to the United States as allá afuera, right, out there, literally. And so, yes, people don't live deluded in that sense. They don't know and understand that they're a territory of the U.S., that they are U.S. citizens, but there's a feeling, there's something in our own national idiosyncrasy as Puerto Ricans that makes us understand that Puerto Rico is fundamentally different. I mean, it's the result of continuous human occupation for thousands of years, even before the Colombian encounter, right? It's a place with its own idiosyncrasy, its own culture that has been shaped by the U.S. Puerto Rico relationship in the last 120 years, for sure. But I think that people in Puerto Rico have that knowledge, that have that sense that they are in a place that is different from the United States.
Well, if we're going in order, this really dovetails from the other question. So to really answer the question, if a Martian comes down and says, what is Puerto Rico? It's a contradiction in terms. We're both natural-born U.S. citizens, just like anybody in Florida, Texas, or anywhere else. And I do take exception with saying that Puerto Ricans are second-class citizens. If Donald Trump moves to Puerto Rico tomorrow, he's still a U.S. citizen, and he can't vote for himself. So the issue isn't the citizenship, it's where you live. Some in the statehood party call it geographic discrimination. I think that's a little bit more accurate. But so we're as U.S. citizens, natural born, as we are a Caribbean, Latin American nation. We do have our own national identity and our own national flag, but the flag of the United States and the national anthem of the United States is played side by side by La Borinqueña and the Puerto Rican flag. So it's a coexistence. Some call it a contradiction, but that's what we are. And like Juan said, when we travel to the States, we say, vamos a los Estados Unidos, we're going to the U.S. And we know that we're not blind. When we see every building in the island has the American flag, we know who's our sovereign. But when in 1952 we received the Constitution, it was invoked to say, we have the best of both worlds. We're as Latin American as we are part of the U.S., we have the benefits of U.S. citizenship and U.S. rule of law with the flexibility and the culture of a Caribbean island, and for a lot of years that worked, but it never resolved the fundamental issue of the democratic deficit. You can call it colonialism, any way you shape it. The problem of not voting for your elected for the representatives that rule over you is an issue. The problem is that we're very divided as to how to solve it. So to answer the question, how do Puerto Ricans talk about this versus here? Unfortunately, people in all political parties in Puerto Rico come to D.C. They want to have more access to federal funding, and they write letters saying, as U.S. citizens, we deserve the same amount of funding and everything else. Then they travel to Puerto Rico, and even some of the statehood party people call Puerto Rico their país, their country, which it is. As Scotland is a country, even though it's not independent. So that's not a contradiction. It's just a little complicated. But there is a double discourse. When you see in MSNBC, the Americans in Puerto Rico died. I have a lot of friends in Puerto Rico that scratch their head and say, well, we don't refer ourselves as that. Yes, we're proud U.S. citizens. We've served in the military. More than 200,000 actually have served. Many have died wearing the uniform. And that's not a contradiction in saying, well, my country is Puerto Rico, my citizenship belongs to the U.S. But we don't necessarily speak in the same terms in English and in the U.S. as we do in Puerto Rico and in Spanish. And that's something that is on us. Because if we expect the mainstream media to know what we are, we should also have to be able to explain it in a consistent way. And panels like this is useful so we can try to explain it. But if you get 5 Puerto Ricans in a room, you'll get 20 different answers to this question.
That's true. That's also true.
Do we have any other perspectives?
Well, with regards to the hurricane, I could tell you that I found information either on Facebook, calling a friend of a friend of a friend who had an aunt or an uncle living in the same neighborhood as your parents in order to know that the neighborhood still was standing after the hurricane. Now, with regards to whether the public discourse about Puerto Rico is focused on the right issues, I have to say that sometimes it's not focused on the right issues. Because how can you expect a place to succeed when you take away the tools for it to work? Federico mentioned something that I heard a lot when I was a kid. The Commonwealth is the best of both worlds. The problem is that dream was not only a lie, it just became a nightmare. And we saw it. We saw it during the financial crisis, which happened before Maria, and Maria just reiterated it. Supreme Court has also said that for double jeopardy purposes in criminal cases, Puerto Rico is not its own sovereign entity. Puerto Rico is just a subset, an instrument of the United States Congress. And you look at the Constitution, it's very clear. Congress shall make all rules for the territories, territorial clause. Now, with regards to, I stand by what I said earlier with regard to the second-class citizenship. That's what it is. That's what it is. If it wasn't, there wouldn't be Puerto Ricans leaving for the 50 states. There wouldn't be. Why will you come to the 50 states? Are you going to get better climate than in Puerto Rico? Are you looking for better food? Are you looking for better parties? What are you looking for in coming from the mainland? People come here to the 50 states. Federico, Juan, Angelique, and I. We came here for better opportunities. Opportunities that were refused to us in the island because they either don't have the funding, they don't have the capacity to provide us with the opportunities. So what do you have in Puerto Rico? Brain drain. I know you're going to get to that later, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So Juan, in a June 1st blog post for the Union of Concerned Scientists, states, over the last few decades, we have seen the Puerto Rican populace's vulnerability to extreme weather hazards increase as the built environment and social services infrastructure decays. Puerto Ricans and their families flee at an increasing tempo to the United States, and the frequency and intensity of hurricanes in the Caribbean increases. To what extent and in what ways would you say that the catastrophic effects of Hurricane Maria were exacerbated by existing infrastructural and economic issues on the island?
I'll illustrate it this way. I was talking to a public health expert from Puerto Rico a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me that he didn't think that Hurricane Maria was what destroyed Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico had already been destroyed 20, 30 years ago by the fiscal crisis that had been brewing up over a long time. And then I thought that then the hurricane was some sort of climatological, broom that just swept away the crumbling infrastructure. And so it's very obvious to me that the infrastructural deficit that Puerto Rico had been carrying over, especially in the generation and distribution infrastructure for power, through really bad and corrupt and inefficient fiscal mismanagement of the power company, Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, or PREPA in English, and the refusal to invest in renewable energies, in energy sources that would lead us away from fossil fuels, the continuously ignoring the Puerto Rican climate scientists and coastal scientists and ecologists who have been warning the government for decades that we needed to get ready for those sorts of hurricanes. I was just at a policy event with a bunch of Puerto Rican scientists in Caguas a couple of weeks ago, where we launched something called the Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network through our friends at Ciencia Puerto Rico and other scientific societies. And there were veteran climate scientists there who were saying these things, who were saying, we told the planning board, the Junta de Planificación Ambiental, 30 years ago, maybe 10 years before Hugo or something like that, Hurricane Hugo, that we needed to get ready for hurricanes of category 3, 4, and 5. And the government officials said, well, those are hypothetical hurricanes. Basically, they were saying that because there were simulations in a computer, they were hypothetical and they had no basis in reality. Well, Hugo happened and Maria happened. Now they're warning, and they're being ignored again, that the international airport will be underwater in 20 years, chronically. So we have the impacts of sea level rise. We have the impacts of climate change, which also mean warmer temperatures, thermal expansion of water, because water is expanding because it's getting hotter, and we see a failure of recognizing those impacts at the federal level and at the local level in the Puerto Rican government. So that, combined with all the fiscal crisis that have been brewing up in Puerto Rico for the last 30 years or so, that was really the combination of all these factors that then led to this large amount of destruction. And I think now, to go back a little bit to the previous question about if public discourse in Puerto Rico is focused on the right issues, I'm starting to see now that some of these the issues that I think are the right ones in terms of climate change, resilience, and vulnerability, and developing a recovery for Puerto Ricans that is resilient to climate, that attends the needs of people, that is out there in public discourse now, a lot more than it used to be. And there's also many other things that others in Puerto Rico, political minorities, have been saying for a long time, such as the need to get rid of, for example, the Jones Act, for the lack of an adequate framework for Puerto Ricans to exercise their democratic rights in the island. So I see that some of those issues, what I think are the right issues, are percolating through public discourse much more than they used to in the past. Can we give some time to Angelique?
I was going to ask if someone could tell us a little bit about the Jones Act.
Okay, the Jones Act. That is not my specialty, but maybe Federico. But I will say that I think that obviously the hurricane is a big topic of conversation, and it's very different from what it was 2 years ago to what it is now. And the very positive part is that now we are part of the conversation and we have a seat at the table, which I think is fantastic. But the severity of the hurricane and the massive destruction of the infrastructure had to do that we had pre-existing conditions. We had a power grid that didn't work, not because of Hurricane Maria. It didn't work 20 years ago, and it's an ongoing issue. So I think that for me is the most important part. Now, post-hurricane, 1 year after, there is still more work to be done, but at least we are part of a conversation to attract positive solutions.
Yes, please.
So what is the Jones Act? It's a 1920s law that requires that all interstate commerce be conducted in U.S. Manufactured, owned, and operated vessels. That's the Jones Act for maritime purposes, but there's also air cabotage, ground cabotage. Obviously, Puerto Rico is not going to receive any trucks anytime soon from the mainland, but we obviously have a lot of shipments from planes and from ships. In Puerto Rico, there's a saying, eso fue lo que trajo el barco. And that's a saying that goes back all the way from Spain, because Puerto Rico back then, not now, was an isolated island, and literally depended on anything that came from the boat to eat and to buy. So we import 80% of our food and most of our goods. And so the U.S. Merchant Marine is one of the most expensive in the world. The Virgin Islands, our neighbor territory, is exempt from the Jones Act. And what many people argue is that if you exempt Puerto Rico from the Jones Act, you insert competition, because then interstate commerce could be conducted not only in U.S. ships, but also in foreign ships. It's a protectionist law. John McCain, God rest his soul, was basically the only promoter of eliminating the Jones Act, not just for Puerto Rico, but for the US. It's a complicated issue, like with a lot of things, but I'll leave you with this anecdote. I used to work in the US Department of Transportation under the Obama administration, and we had the Maritime Academy, the Merchant Marine Academy, in Kings Point, New York, under our jurisdiction. We went and visited, and basically they were telling us, look, we're training all of these merchant mariners, but they wind up going and working in foreign flagged vessels and ships and companies because there aren't enough US ships to go around. And Puerto Rico's energy problem is exacerbated by the fact that we import oil, and that's how we produce energy, which is just so anachronistic. But even if we decided to transition to natural gas, there aren't any US vessels that carry liquefied natural gas to Puerto Rico. That's a problem. Some people say, well, there's 3, one is over there somewhere, but in effect, that's been an impediment. Now, people try to blame the Jones Act for everything. Oh, we couldn't get foreign assistance because of the Jones Act. That's not really true. It does have from $500 to $1 billion of additional cost that we wouldn't have otherwise. So that is hurtful. But again, with many things I could go on. I think I'll leave it at that.
Just briefly, just to give you an idea of how fraught with politics the whole issue of the Jones Act is, the RAND Corporation came out with a report a couple of weeks ago or so, documenting the cost of the Jones Act, right? And on the basis of that, the Puerto Rican government was urged to, or wanted to, petition Congress for removal of suspension of the Jones Act for the territories. But I think a congressman by the name of Hunter,
Duncan Hunter, who's under indictment.
Right, who's under indictment in California and who also represents the maritime shipping interests, pressured the Puerto Rican government to drop that, and they did. So that leads somebody like me to think, well, whose interest does the current Puerto Rican government serve? Do they serve the interests of the people of Puerto Rico who would benefit from the suspension of the Jones Act so that the cost of common goods will be reduced substantially, or do they represent the interest then of the shipping industries?
To clarify, the government did come back and rewrite, after the indictment, the report, and they asked for a limited exemption from the Jones Act. But I agree they should have done it from the start.
If I could jump in on the Jones Act. So I'll take a different view from my 2 distinguished colleagues. I would support the Jones Act, and I'll tell you why. Number 1, it creates jobs all across America. Number 2, it creates a shipbuilding industry in America. Number 3, you have maritime academies all across America. Number 4, it would lead to higher unemployment here. At a time when you have China and other developing countries taking jobs away out of this country, we should not be allowing foreign flagged vessels to be transporting these goods for a couple of reasons. Number 1, they probably don't have the same regulations and the same environmental standards that U.S. flagships do. That's number 1. Number 2, in a times of war, you can guarantee that you could have ships to bring these products. Federico said it just very well. He said 80% of the food imports in Puerto Rico come from the 50 states. You would be risking 3.4 million people in the island. Now, on the LNG point that Federico just mentioned, there are about 2 or 3 LNG tankers currently under construction that will probably be delivered on time for when PREPA conducts this transition from petroleum to LNG. Now, with regards to the products in the island, a lot has been said about how expensive it is. And it's true, it's very expensive. Products are very expensive, but why? And I would argue to you, it's not only about the shipbuilding costs. It's when you bring a product to Puerto Rico, and as soon as it lands on that port, you're charged a tax. If we want products to be cheaper in Puerto Rico, well, maybe we should be eliminating those tariffs and products coming from the 50 states. If we're part of the United States, they shouldn't be taxed. Why, when you have an island where it's going to be pricey to bring products in, because as Trump said, an island in the middle of the ocean, It takes time. It takes manpower.
Yeah.
You need to do so. Now, you're importing, which means people in Puerto Rico also need to make sure that they're able to support agriculture. Try to produce more on the island. That's also a way to reduce costs. That's not being done. No governor across both parties has been supportive in recent times of agriculture. You need to support agriculture. Now, with regards to a long-term solution, if you eliminate the Jones Act, something simple is going to happen. Foreign shipping companies are going to lower their prices at a rate that American shipping companies won't be able to compete. They're going to be driven out of business, and as soon as they're driven out of business, the foreign shipping companies are going to increase the cost because they don't have any competition. If you don't have any competition, why are you going to decrease costs? So that's why, in the end, eliminating the Jones Act is not going to solve the problem.
This is what I meant when I said earlier that that all the decisions that get made that affect Puerto Ricans do not take the interest of Puerto Ricans at all. And defending the Jones Act in the way that Angel has done, to me, is just a playbook right out of the maritime shipping websites, which I consulted, and they called me up when I did write a couple of blogs and say that the Jones Act needed to be lifted. They called me to tell me how wrong I was, and it's exactly those same arguments that you have made. And I don't see why Puerto Ricans need to pay or basically subsidize the U.S. shipping industry. I mean, this is a law from the era of economic protectionism of the United States. I just don't see how that has the interests of Puerto Ricans at heart.
So just quickly, I want to say I see the Jones Act as a layer. I agree with Angel when he said it's a deeper issue. Agriculture is one of the things that we should be focused on. That is how you truly drive economic development. And I just saw Jed Bullock in the audience, which is an expert of the Jones Act, which I do hope that he will weigh in or ask a question when we have that time.
Last row.
Thank you. Speaking of the interests of the Puerto Rican people, I would like to talk about the death count after Hurricane Maria. The official death count from the Puerto Rico Department of Public Safety was initially 64. In May 2018, a Harvard University study estimated that as many as 4,645 people had died as a result of the hurricane. On August 9th, the Puerto Rican government acknowledged a death toll of 1,427, and then a couple of weeks ago, they revised the official death toll to 2,975, with Puerto Rican Governor Ricardo Rosselló acknowledging that these numbers were subject to change. Federico, why is there this huge disparity in reported death tolls, and what does this disparity say about the island's ability to account for its people and its preparedness for future emergencies?
I'm glad that you asked the question that way, because as a Democrat, as somebody who was upset at President Trump for insulting and questioning the death count in Puerto Rico, it's easy to blame the federal government for everything, and they're not without blame. But the death count is really a shared issue in Puerto Rico, mostly an issue of the Commonwealth government. And why is that? Because the death counts, that's a job for the state and local governments, not for the federal government. And what happened in Puerto Rico, there was a breakdown in civil society. The government literally didn't work. The power didn't work, water didn't work. People were incomunicado. There were people literally who couldn't bury their dead because the streets and the bridges were collapsed. So it took a while to have an accurate count. I do believe that initially the government wasn't as transparent with this process. CNN and the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo had to sue to get the death certificates. Eventually, Harvard, GW issued studies that demonstrated that the death toll would probably be in the thousands. And so after the governor, who's a scientist, after reading the evidence, he acknowledged this is the accurate death count. Why? Because death counts after hurricanes, actually the GW study that's cited for the 2,975 count, which is the official count, uses the same methodology as the death count in Katrina, which was about 800 for lack of an accurate number. So the deaths don't only occur when a tree falls down and kills someone in the middle of the storm. The deaths occur when someone dies because their respirator didn't work, because there wasn't any power, because the hospitals were running on diesel and couldn't have enough staff to treat the sick who were coming in. And any disaster-related death has to take into account the effects of that disaster. And so the Harvard number is about 4,900. The GW number is about 3,000. There's another study that puts it at 8,000. I think that the government did the right thing. And they had to acknowledge their own mistakes, which is something that unfortunately the federal government has done, but not by the president. FEMA actually did acknowledge in their after action report that there were mistakes done. But to go back to the death count, it's very difficult to count the dead when people are worried about crime, when they're worried about getting the power and the water back. And to be honest, there were a lot of rumors circulating as to why the death count was so undercounted. Some people were upset at the governor because when he had the president right next door and said, well, Katrina was a real disaster, but 16 at the time when the president arrived, 16 was seen as a low number. And so some people speculated that the government didn't want to confront the Trump administration with a higher death count. We don't know if there was intimidation or not. The government's lobbyists had questioned U.S. senators who were trying to get to the bottom of this. That's been public by Latino Rebels, our partner organization in this panel. But at the end of the day, I think the government did the right thing. They acknowledged their mistakes. They addressed it. And I think that's an example that the president should follow.
I think it's important to point out that as a background to all what Angel said, Federico said, which I completely agree with, Centro de Periodismo Investigativo also reported on the claims or the demands or the concerns that the public health experts in Puerto Rico had way before the hurricane, that the protocols for assigning a death to an event had to be revised, so that you wouldn't go into those situations where there was no contextual information about somebody who died 2 days, 3 days, a week after the hurricane before the dialysis machine didn't have power or the insulin went bad or something like that. And so that's another instance in which I, as a geographer, as a climate scientist, I see it's another instance of ignoring the voices of the scientific communities in Puerto Rico who have been who work who do government work, who have been saying, well, there's these things that we need to do to improve our preparedness, and so that's the contextual information that then helps explain and then magnify the huge undercount of deaths attributable to the hurricane.
Thank you. Nathan Bomey of USA Today put it pretty concisely when he said, Maria escalated Puerto Rico's financial chaos into a humanitarian crisis. Puerto Rico had already, long before the hurricane, suffered from something we call brain drain. Due to the lack of economic opportunity and the social issues that arise as a consequence, Puerto Rico's best and brightest often leave the island for opportunities elsewhere, as the panel's already mentioned. We saw some of this happen in the wake of Maria when anyone who could get out did, and this includes university students who were granted temporary student status at U.S. universities, some of whom have chosen to stay. Angelique, when resources and opportunities are scarce, how can the island be rebuilt in a way that will attract people to move back?
So Michelle, I love your question because that's something that everybody is asking themselves. And for us, at least, and in my view, for me, I could say I'm a product of that because I had to leave the island because I wanted opportunity. And the fact that I live in Washington, I feel that I'm able to help the island from here in a very effective and strategic way. And post-Hurricane Maria, we had a lot of students that were forced to leave. Some were granted free tuition in Tulane University and Cornell. And while they were faced to leave, I happen to know a few of them that have enjoyed the experience of going to a university in the United States, and some of them want to stay. We have been contacted on numerous occasions for them to try to help from here. And that's something that we see as an opportunity, the fact that we can use fresh minds, young people that want to fuel and drive innovation and solutions to the island. And We hope to be able to work with them. I don't know how many of you have heard of a Diaspora Bond, but that is something that McKinsey did a study about, and it's something that I would love to be able to do, to use really the power of the diaspora and the Friends of Puerto Rico, so anybody can come together to a solution and drive projects to the island that can really catalyze change by things that we call results-based financing, and maybe work with the government to really drive those initiatives that can really spur the economic development on the island in a way that is cohesive, but it's also thinking a little bit out of the box and not so much depending on the government, but combining the use of young minds, students, universities, with driving solutions to the island, along with financing that has results that will help us bridge all of the gaps that we have, from education to healthcare to schools, which I know we'll talk about. And that's something that we hope that we can do with all the people that have had to leave and those that just have an interest to help.
I really like that characterization of the diaspora and the potential for the diaspora, because I think we're at a turning point in the post-Maria period where the historically difficult relationship that Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico had with the diaspora, and I was one of those Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico up until 17 years ago, and now I'm in the diaspora. And so that relationship was, I think it used to be very difficult. It used to be very... it used to be very simplistic. Well, you left, so you have nothing to say because you left. And many people still feel like that in Puerto Rico, and I don't blame them for that. I don't agree, but what I'm getting at is that there's an opportunity for us in the diaspora, in the different kinds of professional work that we do, and the different forms of community organization and community organizing that we do, and get our heads together and our arms and legs together, that we can contribute something very significant, I think, to improving conditions over there. Maybe they're not going to be for me, right? For people like me, because some of us made a life already here in the States, and going back to live back over there may not be realistic right now, but to ensure a resilient future for the island.
Bill Clinton, and when he was, I don't know if he was already president, but he had a famous phrase. He said, "There's nothing that's wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right in America." And I think that's a great line. And why do I mention that? Puerto Rico's been in a very dire situation in the past. Puerto Rico was known as the poorhouse of the Caribbean. Our income per capita was about $123 per person per year in the 1930s, and by the 1960s, after Operation Bootstrap, that went up to $3,000, and we created a middle class. And it was an economic miracle, and it was called the showcase of democracy. That didn't eradicate colonialism by any stretch, but there was a marked improvement in the quality of life. So we've done it before, and we can do it again. We need a little help, but we do have a lot of talent between the diaspora and here. And actually, I think the diaspora can serve as the bridge to press the U.S. government to finally help Puerto Rico the way it should be. And if we collectively unite, as we did back in the 1940s and 50s, to transform our island, I think we can do it again.
If I could contribute a little bit to answering this question. Federico is totally right with regards to Operation Bootstrap and increasing per capita incomes in Puerto Rico. Now, the main defect in Operation Bootstrap was depending on tax incentives for the island. When you're dependent on tax incentives and Congress eliminates them, well, you're left without a plan. You don't have a plan, you don't provide solutions, you're not going to solve the problem. Now, what is it that we need in Puerto Rico? What we need in Puerto Rico is incentivizing a middle class. How do you incentivize a middle class? You create jobs. You create opportunity. You maintain adequate access to education. Puerto Rico has one of the cheapest tuition rates in the entire country.
Not for long.
Well, we can go into the discussion about increasing public tuition, but the complaints about increasing the public tuition credit hour, it was from $45 to $58, $70. So when you compare $70 to GW, when I studied there, it was in 2007, it was $1,150 per credit hour. I think I think people could increase a little bit so as to provide better services and people can graduate on time, and universities are able to offer more sections of required courses so as to graduate. Now, with regards to, want to go 1 second to the part of the tax incentives. I disagree with what Federico said earlier, that Puerto Rico is not a tax haven. Puerto Rico is a tax haven today. And you can look it up. It's called Act 22. Act 22 basically says, if you are a resident of the 50 states and you move to Puerto Rico, you will only pay a 4% fixed tax per year. You don't pay tax. You don't pay tax on capital gains. You don't pay tax on dividends. You don't pay any other federal or state income tax. So in other words, you have a great deal. So that's why you have right now in Puerto Rico, hedge fund managers moving down there from New York, where they are evading taxes, basically, because you only, to qualify for this, you only need to live in Puerto Rico for 6 months and 1 day. And who tracks that? Who tracks that? How is the government going to know you were there 6 months and 1 day or 5 months and 28 days? They don't track it. There's easy ways to evade that. So there's rich people who are from the 50 states that are evading taxes by just moving to Puerto Rico. They don't contribute to the island because they're not paying taxes. And then they're creating their own enclaves, $1 million homes in the middle of poor areas and create no opportunity for people down there. So we need to change that. We're basically subsidizing, by federal government permitting this, we're subsidizing the rich at the expense of the poor. And this is something that has to be eliminated and changed. Because there is no proven study that has shown that the 1,500 persons who have signed on to this law, which this agreement is a contract between the government of Puerto Rico and that individual for 35 years. So you move down there, you want to retire, you don't want to pay taxes, just move to Puerto Rico. It's a tax haven. You don't have to go to Monaco. You don't have to go to Switzerland to try to hide your money. You don't have to go to the Cayman Islands. You can just do it on American territory, called the colony of Puerto Rico. Now, that's not the way to bring growth and opportunity to the island. The way to bring growth and opportunity to the island is first providing equal treatment to the people of Puerto Rico. Equal treatment in every single program. I'll give you an example. Federal highways. The Highway Trust Program and the United States Congress, it's only a block grant. About $130 million I provided per year. It's just, you're going to get this, Puerto Rico. We don't care if you need anything more. We don't care how many miles you have of roads. If you're a state, including the colony of DC, you get full formula funding. So Puerto Rico is already at a disadvantage. That's one. Number two, since you have in Puerto Rico an alcohol age, drinking age of 18 versus 21, you're already penalized. So Puerto Rico loses per year somewhere between $20 and $25 million in highway funding just because they refuse to increase the drinking age from 18 to 21 years of age. So that there, you want to help the highways in Puerto Rico? Lobby the politicians down there to increase the alcohol drinking age. Now,
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
well,
That's not
you have to go against industry, and going against industry requires courage, requires mobilization, requires an informed citizenry. And until we don't have that, we're not going to solve this problem, folks. We need the people, the Puerto Ricans living here, not only the Puerto Ricans, the American people supporting the island. And the way to support the island is to end with the colony. You're not going to solve the problem long term if you don't end the colony.
I think there's one way in which recovery is being talked about here in the U.S., not just among the diaspora, but in many other places and like beltway circles and whatnot. And there's a different way in which it's being talked about in Puerto Rico. Here, there's all from all the camps of like Bitcoin bros going down there to Puerto Rico, taking advantage of those laws of massive land grabs from millionaires who are buying devalued assets in the coast and federal aid packages and all of that. And people down there in Puerto Rico are saying, we need our schools and we need jobs. and the Puerto Rican government is responding with pepper gas, with tear gas, pepper spray and tear gas to people, and people from low-income communities that I talked to, that I went down there and talked to scientists who represent them, are talking about developing food co-ops and bringing back agriculture and doing all this grassroots stuff that serves to feed needs at multiple local scales, in small collectives. And so I see a huge disconnect between the ways that we're talking about this, and even myself including within the circles that the public policy work that I do is influential, can have some macro structural impacts like energy, like a resilient energy grid in a decent housing and development and climate resilient housing and development policy. But people down there are doing something else completely different, and I think we need to pay attention to that.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip my education question, and I have a feeling that it'll come up in audience questions anyway. So Federico, what needs to happen for Puerto Rico's economy to get back on its feet at the federal level, at the local government level, and in the private sector?
Again, another one of those 500-year questions. Angel is right that we do lose money because of the drinking age, and he's also right that we have a federal block grant for federal highways. Puerto Rico doesn't pay the gas tax, the federal gas tax, number one. And number two, it's not just about the special interest, meaning the local beer and rum industry, which is very powerful. But it's also a cultural issue. When you go to France and you're 16, nobody asks for your ID to drink wine. Why should it be the same in Puerto Rico? If we were going to protect our culture, it's about protecting a way of life. It's about drinking responsibly. It's not about getting to college and start binge drinking because you saw a drink for the first time in your life and you go nuts. That's one of the things that makes Puerto Ricans who we are. And I don't drink. It's not about glorifying alcohol. It's about being responsible. And I think that's one of the things that people like about Puerto Rico. But regarding the economy, there are many things that need to happen. Again, this is a shared responsibility issue. It's not just what the federal government should do for Puerto Rico. I do agree with Angel that Puerto Rico is devoid of many tools that could help us for economic development. I do agree that one of those should be lifting the Jones Act. I do agree that we shouldn't depend exclusively on tax incentives, but the federal tax reform law that was approved not only gave away $1.5 trillion to the rich in tax cuts, but it also harmed Puerto Rico by imposing new taxes. So Puerto Rico, just so you know, it's an international tax jurisdiction. That's why we don't pay federal income taxes. That's why we can afford to bring all those millionaires to live in Puerto Rico. And so we should take advantage of that. Some would say it's unfair. They would have good arguments to make that argument, but that's the law of the land. And until you change that, that's what we're going to be under. Now, we can tax Puerto Ricans, and then we'll have the situation where we'll be in D.C. with taxation without representation. We do pay federal payroll taxes, so it's not like we don't pay any federal taxes at all. That's another myth. Even if you have sourced income from the states, you have to pay federal income taxes while you live in Puerto Rico. But for Puerto Rico sourced income, you don't have to pay federal income taxes. And what does that allow? A measure of flexibility and competitive advantage that other states don't have, but the states aren't our competitors. Ireland and Singapore are our competitors. And so how do you compete with Ireland and Singapore, not just on manufacturing, but on services? You take advantage of your competitive advantages. Sorry for the redundancy, right? And what are those? A bilingual education, a bilingual, highly educated workforce, a tropical island. We have a tourism industry that only represents 7% of the GDP in Puerto Rico. A beautiful island like Puerto Rico with rainforest, dry forest. We should have ecotourism like they do in Costa Rica. We should have, right now we have volunteer tourism, people that I met in Christmas. They went in the town of Ay Bonito in the mountains just to help a local agrocultural, environmentally friendly farm. So there's many things that we're not taking advantage of. And so in terms of the economy, Puerto Rico really does need a Marshall Plan to rebuild and to be better than it was before. The situation with the power grid is such that if there's another storm, it doesn't have to be a Category 4 storm, it could be even a tropical storm. It will devastate the island again. There are blackouts as we speak, and if we don't have a resilient, decentralized electric system, that won't happen. The federal government appropriated $2 billion to start that process. That hasn't started yet. They literally just patched up the electric grid that we had, which was horrible. And so patching up the electric grid isn't enough. We need a decentralized system that absorbs all the wind and the solar energy that we have around us. LNG, I think, should be a transition fuel, and it should be done with microgrids. Today, in the town of Ciales, 28 homes will now have their own microgrid, and with solar power, which means they're completely off the PREPA, which is the public electric utility grid. And so incentivizing things like that will not only make us energy independent, but also create economic development jobs. So there's a whole host of things, but to sum it up, we need a Marshall Plan. Puerto Rico was devastated. It looked like a war-torn environment, and it'll take that type of aggressive solution to help us.
The LA Times had an article this morning called "The Devastation Without Representation." You should look it up and read it on Puerto Rico.
I think in the different levels, I'm going to try to briefly describe what I think needs to happen. At the federal level, I think we need to start with FEMA. FEMA needs to complete its cost estimates so that it disperses the funds. They haven't dispersed a single fund with regards to public assistance projects, improving infrastructure, repairing, collecting debris. They've only collected 50%. They need to get this money out now, so that economic development, economic growth, jobs are created, and Puerto Rico comes out stronger. That's at the federal level. In the state level, Federico mentioned about the gas tax. With regards to the gas tax, Puerto Rico has their own gas tax, which was increased twice under the Commonwealth government of Alejandro Garcia Padilla. So you go to Puerto Rico, gas prices are going to be higher in the islands than what you pay in Virginia or DC. They're going to be higher in the islands. Now, how are you going to improve Puerto Rico's economy if you don't decrease electricity rates? Electricity rates in the island are 2 times what you pay here, at least. Mm-hmm. Why? First, you have an inefficient system. You still depend on oil for production of electricity. You need to change that. We have the newest plant in Puerto Rico, electricity producing plant, owned by the government, by PREPA, was from the 1970s, okay? 40 years ago. Now, PREPA also needs to fix its business model. You have to eliminate subsidies to corporations. Why are we providing corporate welfare? Why are we providing corporate welfare? And you know who pays for it? The Puerto Rican resident. The poor Puerto Rican resident that's struggling to make ends meet per month, because in Puerto Rico you have lower per capita income than you have anywhere, including the poorest state in the union, which is Mississippi. Puerto Rico has half of the per capita income of Mississippi. That's how poor Puerto Rico is. Puerto Rico has a poverty level of 46%. But then you're requiring people, which is ironic, to pay in their electricity rates subsidies to corporations. You even pay subsidies for hotels, okay? PREPA is providing electricity subsidies to hotels as a way to bring them to Puerto Rico. So they've created in Puerto Rico this culture of depending on tax incentives. The only way you're going to bring people to Puerto Rico or corporations is tax incentives. No, that's wrong. You bring people to Puerto Rico, you bring corporations to Puerto Rico by making Puerto Rico more productive, increasing productivity. How do you increase productivity? Well, we already have a comparative advantage. Puerto Rico was talking about comparative advantages. Puerto Rico has a bilingual population, for the most part, number one. Number two, salaries in Puerto Rico are lower than in the 50 states, which means that you could hire the same electrical engineer at a lower rate, number two. Number three, if you don't solve the electricity problem in the island, you're not going to increase productivity. When corporations conduct their analysis and business assessments and whether or not to invest in the island, they're going to see this is a drag on them. So they're not going to move to the island. Now, why did corporations leave Puerto Rico? Federico mentioned earlier that it was because of 936. I happen to disagree with Federico, and I'll tell you why. Corporations left Puerto Rico because the rules of the global economy changed. Why did they change, or how? First, the World Trade Organization was created that set a system of rules and regulations so that products from countries that are members, and almost every single country is a member of WTO, are treated on a non-discriminatory basis. That's number one. Number two, you have free trade agreements such as NAFTA and CAFTA. NAFTA that includes Canada and Mexico, and CAFTA would included Central America and the Caribbean, and the Dominican Republic, and Federico is correct. So you have in Dominican Republic, which is right next door, lower salaries, less regulation, no federal standards for anything. So they're going to outcompete any corporation in Puerto Rico. Because why? Because instead of paying federal minimum wage, you're going to pay 50 cents an hour, $1 an hour. There's no way to compete with that. There's no way to compete with that if you have free trade when you're Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico, before free trade agreements, had market access through a zero tariff system that gave Puerto Rico a comparative advantage that just went away when you had free trade agreements. So that is what I attribute the problem of job loss in Puerto Rico, the excessive dependence on tax incentives, which once the incentives left, we lost everything. We lost our shirts. And then you have an unproductive electricity monopoly that needs to change and reform.
Thank you. So my final question, and we'll start with Angelique. Where do we go from here? What needs to be done on the island so that a catastrophe of this magnitude can never happen again? And what can we in the United States do to help the island move forward?
Well, we've had economic problems and a financial crisis before the hurricane, but what I will say is that I think I differ a little bit from my colleagues in the panel. I have remained very quietly. But and by the way, the conversation has geared towards a tax conversation. I'm married to a tax attorney, so I feel like I'm having breakfast. That's what we talk about. I want to start by saying that I think Puerto Rico has, because we're an island, we have a fixed mindset. And I would like to see the island with a growth mindset, for us to be more self-sufficient, for us to innovate, to accelerate growth, to really think outside of the box and be part of the global economy. And I feel that sometimes we're trapped because we're very dependent on the federal government. The largest employer on the island is the government. And the catastrophe happened, we lost a lot of friends and family, and we're just pointing fingers 1 year after. So that for me is heartbreaking. We had major losses, but what comes after is for us to really go back to our communities, to our family members, and think of ways to innovate and have a role in the global economy, because we need to be less dependent of the government. There's not enough money in the world, in philanthropy, in government dollars, in private companies to solve and really reduce all the poverty in the world. So I think that we should really innovate and also focus on education as a tool to reduce or remove the poverty longer term.
I could contribute a couple of items. With regards to what can we here do to help the island, I think number one, we need to lobby our politicians. We need to make sure that they know that we know the issues, that we're going to hold them to task, that we're going to hold them accountable. If they don't hear from Puerto Ricans and from our fellow Americans in the 50 states that there's commitment, that there's interest in helping Puerto Rico, people are not going to be supported. People in Congress are not going to take action. When do you see Congress taking action? When there's a big fuzz in the media, when there's a big campaign from civil society, when there's a disaster occurring somewhere. Congress is a reactive institution. It's not a proactive institution, at least not in recent decades. So our task as citizens is to make sure that we educate other people, that we inform other people, that we make sure that our politicians know, our public servants know, that we want to help the island, that we're going to hold them accountable, and to show us and to prove to us that they're doing good for the island.
Can I agree with my esteemed friend and colleague? You really hit it on the mark. If representatives in Congress don't hear from their constituents, they're not going to act. That's why, let me do a shameless plug, that's why I helped co-found an organization called Boricua Activate, which means to activate Boricuas, which is another word for Puerto Rico, to help train the diaspora and our friends on how to best lobby Congress. There are a lot of Puerto Rican groups registering people to vote, and that's key. That's huge to mobilize in the midterms, in the presidential election, and in state and local elections. But it's a drumbeat. If there's a consistent empowerment of the diaspora and our allies to make Puerto Rico an issue, a political issue that politicians care about, and why would they care? Because constituents like you who live in a state and have a voting representative can actually call and say, hey, Puerto Rico is important to me. Can you please co-sponsor a bill to institute a Marshall Plan in Puerto Rico to provide equal funding for Medicaid and other federal health programs? That'll go a long way. And so I urge you all, if you do care about Puerto Rico, call your member of Congress and ask them, what are you doing for Puerto Rico? That'll definitely put Puerto Rico on the radar screen.
I think that mobilization that they're talking about is very important. I don't know about you, but I spent the last year was a very maddening and depressing year, and I was one of the fortunate ones who was able to talk to my family the second day after the hurricane. But I know a lot of people who couldn't talk to them for a while, and so I know that a lot of us are we're mad and we're sad and furious at our government that allowed this to happen. But besides that, I see a lot of people that are very hopeful for the future. People who have moved here. For better opportunities, people who have stayed there because they want to, they see that their role is helping to reconstruct and develop Puerto Rico over there, and I think that we can use that. Those are very powerful emotions that we can use to motivate ourselves to demand a resilient future for our people and for our island that attends to the needs of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, and not just the needs of those who want to continue burning fossil fuels, for example, which are one of the, not just in Puerto Rico, but globally, are really one of the bad actors that have put us on this path. I mean, last week there was a composite image from the tropical areas, a satellite image that showed nine simultaneous storms, like 3 hurricanes, 1 typhoon, and 2 other forming, in flux that didn't have a proper name. That's wild. That's what the future holds if we don't do something about it. And so we are especially vulnerable because we're in the tropics, we're an island. Certainly the relationship with the United States really hasn't helped. And so we need to be able to do something about that. We need to demand a future that's resilient. We need to listen to the scientists who are working with the communities over there, to urge our government in Puerto Rico and here to respect the scientific institutions. Angel was talking about innovation, or Angelique was talking about innovation. There are institutions in Puerto Rico like the Fideicomiso de Cultura y Tecnología. It's a technology trust fund. That's an incubator, and the Puerto Rican government has been intervening that and taking away its budget and changing the governance structure, basically intervening in institutions that could help provide can help jumpstart small projects. There's also the Instituto de Estadísticas de Puerto Rico, the Statistics Institute. The government tried to make it go away or basically politicize it and intervene it. That institute could have helped provide a lot of information. I don't understand why our government had to go all the way to Georgetown University to commission a study that cost $300,000 or so that they would comment on the first press conference. They said that they couldn't give a number. Why didn't they ask the public health community in Puerto Rico? There's this cultural predisposition that we've developed over the last 120 years that we have to look towards the United States all the time for experts, for people who know anything about anything. We have a lot of people in Puerto Rico who know about these things, who have studied them. So we need to look in our own backyard. We don't necessarily need to discount our own people first.
And if I could add one last thing that I forgot to say, and that is follow the news, inform yourselves. Make sure you watch the news, you read the news every single day. Read social media. Read what people are saying. Speak with your friends on the island. Ask them what's going on. What's concerning them. How things are going. Are things improving? Ask them to give you ideas. Maybe join our organization. Let me tell you, I have to work on Puerto Rico issues every day in Congress. Even though in my list of issue areas, it's not listed. Why? Because you can tackle the Puerto Rico issue from every other issue that I have. If it's commerce, if it's science, you name it. I'll give you an example. Congressman Serrano, who I work for, is a member of the Appropriations Committee. In other words, the committee that gives all the federal funding to all the federal agencies all across the government. Congressman Serrano, being from Puerto Rico, understanding the issues more than any other member of Congress that I know, he decided that he wanted to force the National Science Foundation to create a Hispanic Serving Institutions program. This program is funded this year, will probably end up funded at $50 million. Just 2 years ago, it was funded at $15 million. By creating programs that Puerto Rican universities, which are Hispanic serving institutions, there's no doubt about it, they're able to compete for grant funding, receive grant funding, and that alleviates the funding crisis that public universities and private colleges in Puerto Rico are facing. So that's an example of following the issue. Another example was Vieques. Congressman Serrano is a member of Congress, and when you see in the conference report in our Appropriations Committee, is holding the Navy to task every single year to continue the environmental cleanup of Vieques and Culebra. So it takes time. It takes dedication. It takes passion. It takes commitment. And speaking about commitment, Congressman Serrano today introduced a bill called Compromiso. And it will, if enacted, it will force FEMA to provide 100% federal cost share. In other words, Puerto Rico wouldn't have to pay anything for categories A and B, which are used for debris removal, for public assistance, for housing assistance. So we are working with leadership to try to get something done with regards to this area. Because Puerto Rico deserves better. Our people down there are hurting, and it is up to us here and all of us together to make sure that the island comes back stronger, better, and prouder than ever before.
Panelists, thank you. We can take some audience questions. If you will please line up at the microphone in the center aisle, and please indicate who your question is for.
Yes, this question is really either to any of you, Federico, any of the panelists. What is it going to take to have a commission to study what happened with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico? I think every time there's a disaster, every time there's, whether it's a natural disaster or with 9/11, something like that, there's a commission to understand what are the deficits, what are the weaknesses, and what we could do to improve the services and so that this won't happen again. Thank you.
The answer is that Congressman Serrano, Congresswoman Velázquez, Congressman Benny Thompson, Senator Gillibrand from New York, and others actually introduced a bill to do just that. To have a national independent commission like the 9/11 Commission or like the Katrina Commission to get to the bottom of it, to hold people accountable, to learn lessons and not to repeat the same mistakes. So what can we do? Call your member of Congress and ask them to sponsor that bill. That's what you need to do.
What will it take? A new Senate?
What?
A new Congress, basically?
Oh yeah, and vote in November. But you don't we shouldn't have to wait till the elections to tell our elected representatives what we want. And if we start saying it now, when and if we have a new Congress, there's going to be momentum to get it done.
Hola, Fede. ¿Me recuerdas?
Hola. Wow.
Después hablaremos.
My old teacher from AU.
Yep. One comment and a question. 30 years ago, I worked for the shipbuilding industry. So I don't purport to be an expert on the Jones Act, but 30 years ago, the shipbuilding industry was hanging by a thread, and the Jones Act was in place in part as a protectionist measure, and it was not going to save the shipbuilding industry. And it's basically a one customer industry, which is usnavi, as Puerto Ricans would say, so it's the Navy. Except for some smaller crafts. So we have an expert apparently on the Jones Act who might be able to shed more light. Question, and I don't know who could answer it best. I read an article that was quite disturbing along the lines of throwing good money after bad about the power grid, that FEMA money was only by law supposed to not upgrade things. It wasn't supposed to improve anything. It was only supposed to fix things to where they were before. So, I mean, that makes no sense at all. That's like, I was also reading about the mold that exists in house. So that's like keeping the moldy wall and putting fresh paint on it.
I will make my insurance industry family very proud in saying that in the insurance industry, we call that the difference between replacing what you've lost to replacement cost versus actual cash value. And that is literally the bare minimum, bringing you back to the 15-year-old refrigerator that you have decaying in your basement.
Right, but if it's back to something that didn't work in the first place, it's a complete waste of the money that's being used. So can something be done to...
Well, something already has been done. The Stafford Act, which mandated exactly what you said, was amended. Some argue, and Angel could answer that better than I, that Congress gave a discretionary authority to FEMA to be able to, if they wanted to build back better, which is what we thought that they should have done. And apparently they're going to start it now, which is a year too late. But I think there should be a mandate to do it that way, not just a discretion. But maybe Angel has more information on that.
Well, with regards to what you just mentioned, in one of the disaster supplementals, a provision was included to waive that provision in its application to Puerto Rico and the affected areas. It doesn't make any sense to try to build a plant to the 1970s style that it was before the hurricane, when probably that technology doesn't even exist anymore. So yes, you're right. And in dealing with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it was complicated because they don't like the word resilience. So we tried to frame it in a way that we accomplish resilience without actually labeling it resilience, so as to minimize partisanship and bring bipartisanship, and we got it accomplished. Now, back to my earlier point that I mentioned, FEMA has now the ball is in FEMA's court. And they have to keep it moving, get the ball rolling. They need to make sure that the money is out, that they disperse the funds in a timely and efficient manner, not a year later, in a timely and efficient manner, because Congress already took action. So the holdup is not with Congress, holdup is at FEMA. And you have right now a FEMA administrator that it's under potential criminal investigation for use of government resources for personal use. This person probably is not going to be the best person to be able to help Puerto Rico, because he's probably going to be trying right now to save his own skin rather than help the island build back stronger and build back better.
I think a particular reality of FEMA with, not being legally able to build better, just to build things the way they are. It's just indicative of policies and the whole framework in the federal government that is really failing to anticipate and to deal with a changing climate. And you know, I mean, there's all this maneuvering that you guys just described, right? That had to be done then to exempt then FEMA from that. That probably will be temporary or something like that. But there needs to be a better framework at the federal level that empowers the federal government and the agencies and the states and all the other jurisdictions to deal with all of these impacts. Because, I mean, we just had Florence in the North Carolinas, and it was known that 6 years ago or so, the North Carolina legislature chose to ignore coastal sea level rise projections in their coastal development plans, and so one of the results of that was probably all of this flooding that we saw as a result of that.
I have a couple of different questions. The first one goes with the Jones Act. It seems to me that I wouldn't say eliminating the Jones Act. I would say modifying the Jones Act that in Puerto Rico, we could also receive vessels from other countries, like the vessels from other countries arrive to the United States. Obviously, there's an infrastructure here in the United States to inspect these vessels, to make sure that they're safety enough to arrive in here, and then all the merchandise have to be transported into a U.S. vessel to be able to arrive into Puerto Rico. It seems to me that one thing to boost the economy of Puerto Rico would be that Puerto Rico is one of those ports that receive vessels from other countries. So the vessels, before arriving to the United States, stop in Puerto Rico, get inspected. Puerto Rico could benefit from that. Everything that they don't have to transport everything into another vessel. It's just like we're strategically located in the middle of the Caribbean. We're like a door from the Panama Canal. It doesn't make any sense that ships have to come here to go back there. Mm-hmm. That's my first point of view. The second thing is that I would like to see a comparison of Puerto Rico and Hawaii. Hawaii is a state, yes, but Hawaii has a lot of the main issues that we were discussing here of the infrastructure. It's an island, like Trump said, in the middle of an ocean. So it has a lot of the same issues. So why isn't that in Hawaii, when they have a disaster, like they just had the volcano, they just had a hurricane, the catastrophe is not as big as in Puerto Rico? In my point of view, is that Hawaii has representation with power to vote in Congress. So in my perspective, a lot of these problems that we have in here right now could be resolved if we just start advocating and everybody in here makes this something that can happen, and we can make this happen with the government system that we have right now. We need representation with power to vote, representation for the people that are in the island. That just for the congressman that you're working for, he's from Puerto Rico, he's a Puerto Rican, he's doing all these things, but he's from really representing New York. Why is it that he has to be representing the Puerto Ricans in New York to get something done in the island? It's just, this is the time that we need that to change. That's the main thing that for me needs to change in here. We need representation with power to vote to make things happen in the island to people that reside in the island, not the Puerto Ricans that just move here.
I love your answer, your proposed solution. I totally agree with you. You see, when I see Hawaii, years ago they used to say, the coquí doesn't live anywhere except Puerto Rico. I went to Hawaii 2 years ago. I was in the big island of Hawaii, right next to the volcanoes. I was driving at night. I put the windows down. I felt I was in Calle. Because I heard more coquís than I had ever heard before, okay? So the coquís definitely live very well in statehood. Maybe
I think they might be an invasive
Maybe they saw things weren't going so good, so they said, well, we better move to a state. What better than Hawaii? Now, to your point, I would, and this is something that I wanted to say, and I'm glad you brought it up. Hawaii is it's just the same thing as Puerto Rico, but it has 55 years of statehood. So you see economic development. You see from 1959, when I was admitted as a state, Hawaii had tremendous economic development, economic growth, produced opportunities. You see, everyone wants to go to Hawaii. You see a federal response, inadequate federal response. And you said it very correctly. You hit the nail on the net. You hit the nail on the head when you said adequate representation, political power. You have political power, senators, members of Congress from that jurisdiction are going to hold agency administrators, such as the FEMA administrator, to task. They're going to bring them before the committee. You have seniority in Congress, you have power. If you're on Appropriations Committee, imagine having a Puerto Rican member on the Appropriations Committee. I guarantee you that agency head would be doing everything in his or her power to make things right. Because if not, they would lose their funding or receive less funding. Now, with regards to the part that you mentioned about the Jones Act, under the Jones Act, the only products or the only merchandise that needs to be transported on American flag ships is between two ports that are U.S. ports. You could receive very easily, like you just mentioned, foreign flagged vessels directly from a foreign country in Puerto Rico. But you know what was the problem? Problem is this idea was in Puerto Rico for probably 30, 40 years. But the bureaucratic mess, the lack of strategic vision, and the political partisanship down there prevented a port like the Port of Ponce from coming to fruition. So Dominican Republic saw this idea, and they said, well, we could do this. So they went ahead and did it. So you receive a lot of foreign products in the Dominican Republic. They stopped there. And that could have easily been done in Puerto Rico if it was done right and if it was done in a bipartisan manner. It wasn't done. That's why the Port of Ponce is still not working. Those are my...
May I? I think while the case of Hawaii may be very tempting to take as an example of a successful statehood story, we can't forget that affluence in Hawaii is largely not extended to the native Hawaiians. And native Hawaiians live in really, really dire conditions of poverty compared to the rest of the population. The way that Hawaii was turned into a state was basically through genocide, by murdering and assassinating the indigenous leadership, including Kamehameha, which was the leader of Hawaii, removing many of the indigenous people from there, replacing them with GIs, and then and then creating a referendum process a plebiscite process to add Hawaii to the Union. So yes, Hawaii may seem like a tropical paradise to many of us, but that's only for the people who can afford that. And largely, most native Hawaiians live in dire conditions of poverty, and I don't know how many native Hawaiians indigenous Hawaiians of indigenous blood are represented.
They're not the majority. They're mostly Polynesian, Japanese, and Americans from the mainland.
So we need to ask ourselves if we really want to have a Puerto Rico that's developed and rebuilt, that in 55 or 100 years is going to be replaced by a whole bunch of vulture capitalists and disaster capitalists. And that's the way that it looks like right now.
I want to go to the gentleman's question, but I think you want to say something.
I just wanted to bring up the point that I'm talking about how representation with power to vote with the government system that we have now. In my point of view, the government system that Puerto Ricans have right now is flexible, and it was designed to be flexible. And maybe this is the time to push on those flexibility bounds so we can have representation with power to vote. We don't have to get a drastic change to be on stage or whatever to get representation with power to vote. Rules are made to be changed.
Well, that's an interesting proposition. But I remind you again that in 2005, Louisiana had 2 senators and 6 or 7 members of Congress when Katrina hit. Another angle on the Jones Act is something called the Stevens Amendment, which basically allows Alaska to be exempt from air cabotage laws, and it becomes an international air shipping center. And there's a proposal for Puerto Rico to have the same benefit. I think that would go a long way. And on your question on the ships, Angel was right. Between U.S. ports, you can have foreign ships, but you can receive them directly from a foreign country. The problem is that when you have a ship coming from Europe to Puerto Rico, will it go back to Europe? It'll be a lot easier to take Puerto Rican products to Florida. So that's my question on that. And on statehood and representation, again, Katrina had a problem. Statehood really didn't solve it. I'm not asking or suggesting that we shouldn't change our status. But realistically, right now, while we have a fiscal control board, while we have $70 billion in debt, while we're trying to rebuild, yes, the status issue is important, but I think we need to unite to rebuild Puerto Rico, and what we learn through that process will probably shed some light on how to resolve the status of the island. But while there's a fiscal control board, the status isn't going to change, unfortunately.
Can I suggest that we keep our responses 30 seconds and then we can move the conversation on the other side? I see this young man that I hope that he's from the Washington Center. No. Oh, but he wants to ask a question. Oh, okay.
So in the interest of time, the library does close in about 10 minutes. So I would say we have time for 2 more questions.
Can I make a suggestion? Why don't we let these folks say their questions, and then we'll all try to answer them so that they can get the opportunity to at least ask.
Okay.
Thank you. I've been locked in the library garage before, so it's not fun. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate this panel. Any frustration that you put forward, I think is based on love, right? Yes. And passion for la patria grande y la patria chica, right? I'll let you decide which one is which. My question is, you use a loaded term and calling Puerto Rico a colony. And I want you to go into a little detail, because of the time, of what that means. Because a colony means, it's a loaded term. It means exploitation. It means lack of local ownership of the resources, and lack of, besides the issue of political representation. And I think my personal idea is that Puerto Rico will really gain from having 2 senators in the US Congress, or at least that level of representation. But I'm not a Puerto Rican, so I'm just looking from that side. So anything that you can elucidate what you mean by colony will be greatly appreciated.
Hello. My question is similar to a question that was asked in the panel, but I want to address it from a youth perspective. And it's actually addressed to each one of you. And that would be, what would be your elevator pitch to convince a young Puerto Rican student like myself, who has grown up in Puerto Rico with daily news about debt, government corruption, crime, protest, outward migration, and now destruction, to forgo the many possibilities found here in the mainland and return back to Puerto Rico to raise it from the ground up? Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I also wanted to congratulate you for assembling the panel of the extremely smart and eloquent panelists. Thank you for your answers. They were all really clear and very instructive. However, I'm a bit disappointed because each and every one of you just basically gave us a lot of facts about your own agenda. And we came here to figure out what can we do to help Puerto Rico and how can Puerto Rico do to help itself. My suggestion, and then I will ask my question, is that it needs to come from every single Puerto Rican, not Puerto Rico as a whole. It's all about integrity, self-respect. The moderator talked about how proud Puerto Ricans are. Well, I didn't see any pride in Puerto Ricans when our president, who is a human, flaws and virtues aside, throwing paper towels at a crowd and everybody just saying, "Yay, you gave me a piece of bounty." Okay? Yes, brilliant panel, amazing answers. But for as long as those agendas are what dominates the conversation, nothing is going to happen. And I'm going to tell you why. Okay? Because statehood is a carrot that you're shown half of Puerto Ricans tied to a rope by the waist. And independence and our Olympic Committee is another carrot tied to another group of Puerto Ricans pulling in the other direction. And the few of us who want to try to help, we're just giving water to the people pulling in different directions. So thank you for your answers. They are absolutely correct in each and every way. Your eloquency is fantastic. But for as long as those answers keep pulling Puerto Rico apart into different directions, Congress is just going to sit there. They're going to look at us. They're going to keep throwing towels, and they're going to laugh at us. So, I mean, that's just my 2 cents.
So do you have a question?
My question is, up to what point are we just going to keep pushing agendas that we have no control over, instead of, like Angelique said, looking back and saying, wait a minute, I need to rehabilitate my agriculture, and I cannot look to the states to fix that problem. Let that be statehood or giving us our independence, because independence is not easy. That problem is not going to be solved right away. People in Puerto Rico need answers now. And agriculture comes to mind. Manufacturing comes to mind. The panel mentioned innovation. Well, I work for the patent office. I've been doing it for 20 years. Innovation is my business, okay? Where is that going to come from? It's not from Puerto Rico, from within. And then we can sit calmly and talk about the different point of view and find an answer that will work for everybody. That's my question. When is that going to happen?
Who do you want us to answer first?
Maybe in order of the questions.
Well, my suggestion, since I suggested everybody ask questions, is that we all answer all the three, because in the interest of time, we only have 10 minutes. So I guess I'll go first. What is a colony? I think that's a symbol of expressing the frustration that we have an unjust relationship with the U.S. You can call it a subordinated situation. You can call it a deficit of democracy. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But when a country rules over another, it sets its laws, and you can't have a say or vote in it. People can call it a colony. Literally, a colony is when a group of people from one country go and populate another, which is what happened in Hawaii. That hasn't happened in Puerto Rico, except maybe for those 1,500 people not paying taxes in the island. So it's debatable whether we fit the textbook definition of what a colony is, but I think when Puerto Ricans are angry and say that we're a colony, what it means is it's an unjust, unfair, undemocratic relationship for the reasons Angel eloquently expressed. What can we do for youth to want to come back to Puerto Rico? Well, innovation, like Angelique said, uniting our voices here so that if we have a federal government that is more responsive to Puerto Ricans, if you follow the Angelique model, which is, I'm not going to wait for the government, I'm going to raise money, I'm going to go physically there to help people. You don't have to wait for all of these pipe dreams to come true to act, which I think is the model. And then if we're successful, maybe there's a better island to go back to, and at least you can contribute while you're here. And I think to the last point, I think that you were criticizing us for having an agenda, but I think you just wanted to let off some steam and talk about your own. And as I mentioned to the young lady in the front, we need to talk about status, but I think that at the moment we need to rebuild and unite behind that effort. And I think, again, when you mentioned Vieques, we did unite on a common purpose, and we got the Navy out. If we unite to rebuild and reconstruct Puerto Rico, that'll teach us a lot about what we can do as a united island to solve our political status. So that's my spiel.
I'll briefly take the colony question. It's very simple. We currently have a fiscal control board that everybody from the governor down in the Puerto Rican government answers to. That was created by a congressional act, and the board was appointed by President Obama. That's a colony. Suspension of democratic rights.
Well, let me contribute a little bit into the term colony. Colony, I would see it as a piece of land controlled by sovereign country where people don't have full representation or full democratic rights, and where that political entity called colony does not prosper long term. Because I've never seen a colony around the world prosper. I don't know if you've seen one. I've never seen a colony prosper. With regards to what the gentleman said of having agendas, or the panelists having agendas, there's no agenda here. It's just a matter of confronting a reality. And the reality is, we could try to give more aid to Puerto Rico, and it's necessary, and we're working on that. But these are just, in the end, if we don't solve the fundamental problem of the colonial status, we're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And we don't need Band-Aids. What we need is real political, structural, economic reform that improves the island, that improves opportunity for everybody. Why are we all here? Ask yourselves that question. Why are we here? We're here to learn. We're also here to contribute ideas to each other. But we're also in the state of Virginia. Why? Because we have better opportunities here than what we had in the island. At least unfortunately, I had to leave the island because I was looking for better opportunities. I love my island. I go back to Puerto Rico as often as I can. I love Puerto Rican food. You give me a choice of a hamburger and rice and beans, I'll always take rice and beans. Just because I'm speaking English and I work in Congress doesn't mean that I forgot about my beloved island. Being Puerto Rican, having an identity, it's not going to change with any political status. It's not going to change with state. You're not going to stop being a Puerto Rican because it's no longer the colony of Puerto Rico, but the state of Puerto Rico. That's not going to happen. Those that lose their identities lose it because they don't cherish it. So if we cherish our identities, like I know everyone in this room does, and our Puerto Ricanness, we shouldn't fear confronting this reality. We shouldn't fear. That's why I encourage you, all of you, to think about, why are you here? Why are you in the state of Virginia? Why do you leave Puerto Rico? Do you come for a better climate, for better beaches? Or do you come for more opportunities? And I think if you answer that question to yourself, I think you'll figure out then that we that had the opportunity to leave the island in search of better opportunity, we should want the same rights, the same responsibilities, the same opportunities that we enjoy here for the 3.4 million American citizens residing in the island of Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Angelique, the final word.
I'll take the elevator pitch. And this is very improvised because you spoke very fast. Imagine you can have a world-class education and then tackle the world's most complex issues from paradise and receive a credit in your student loan while doing so. Not convinced? Maybe?
That's a good elevator pitch. Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you.
Gracias.
Yo